All right. Okay, so coming out of the Compromise 1850, there was an element or a part of the Compromise 1850 that was almost immediately disliked, and that was the fugitive slave law. Like right away, Southerners could see that Northerners weren't going to back that. So this was a highly disliked part of this law by the North. And then, as a kind of 1-2 punch, in the year 1852, so not long after the compromise was passed and ratified, this lady, now she is part of that very famous tribe of Americans called the Beecher family. All right, the Beechers are a product of the Second Great Awakening. In many ways, they are the first family of the Second Great Awakening. And Harriet Beecher Stowe is a writer. She's an author, and she's going to come down to Kentucky, which again, not the Deep South, and see slavery firsthand, and then write about a fictional account of a Deep South slavery experience. She's going to write about particularly the end where an individual, a family gets sold down the river. Remember that expression? She's going to really talk about the horrors of the slave auction, the separation of a family. She's going to talk about or write about runaway slaves. So she's going to put the entire sort of slave narrative into a very readable book. And by readable, I mean, this is not written like high prose. This is more, it reads like you're reading a teleplay. In fact, it becomes a hugely popular play. And so around the world, not just in the United States, but this is a bestseller in England, for example. And you can see, guys, if you sell 2 million copies of a book today, you're a huge bestseller. You're Stephen King quality, like this is big time. You're Harry Potter, all right? So 2 million copies tells you how big this book is. And with the connection between the Compromise of 1850 and this, as Lincoln says, many Northerners become more and more opposed to slavery because the horrors of slavery depicted in this book. And they think more than 2 million people read this book because people loaned it to each other. It was the most popular book of its age besides the Bible. Very popular book, very big bestseller. So please know Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom is a saintly sort of heroic figure as a slave. He's humble. He's a Christian. He's dependable. And once he gets sold down the river, he still tries to be, a good servant, a good slave, as you might say. But then he refuses to do a certain type of action that he considers evil. And his master has him, with his 2 handlers, beaten to death. So Uncle Tom becomes the martyr. Sorry, spoiler alert. Uncle Tom becomes a martyr in this story and tragically, depicts what happens when you're sold down the river and try to maintain your integrity and your decency and your honesty. So many different characters in the book, but he's obviously the protagonist, the main character. And this is sort of a coda, but somehow tragically, because Uncle Tom is sort of an obedient slave in the book, his name becomes synonymous with obedient Black people, subservient Black people. And sadly, it passes into the American lexicon as like a Black person who's kissing a white person's butt. And that's not accurate from the book. In other words, being an Uncle Tom would have been like a heroic figure, but today that means like being somebody who's a Black person who kisses up the white people. So that's unfortunate, and it's a misappropriation of the term, but it happens. Nonetheless, at the time, he becomes this martyr figure. And because our book is so widely read, many people who had been sort of ambivalent, you remember that word means? Without really caring one way or the other. Ambivalent. They've been ambivalent on the subject of slavery in the North, right? But after reading this book, millions potentially, we don't know for certain, like it was a public opinion poll, but we know that it was popular, of people began to oppose slavery, which means they went from being neutral to being against. And that's why Lincoln credits her as the little lady who starts the Great War, the Civil War. He says it's your book, that changed the hearts and minds of the public. And I tend to agree with him. It's not William Lloyd Garrison. Sadly, it's not even Frederick Douglass. It's this book because it's popular. And so, if you really want to affect the public opinion, you have to reach the public, right? And you know, she was one of the few people who actually got a wide audience, got enough people to listen. And she was very much an abolitionist. Okay, but please know Harriet Beecher Stowe and the impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin, enormously important. That's going to accelerate what was already beginning with the Compromise of 1850. Now, far less read, but also significant. So this is a book that's completely different in terms of subject matter, in terms of how it's written, who it's written by, but it still has an effect. And this book is called The Impending Crisis of the South, as you can see. And the author is a Southern poor white representative, Kenton Helper. He is a white man from the South saying that slavery is bad for poor white people in the South. Understand? So that is high heresy. One thing for a Northern abolitionist to write a book that you can ban, but for a Southern white guy to write a book and say, slavery is bad for us. You understand? From a racial perspective, yes, but more importantly from his perspective, because it keeps us poor. In other words, the reason why we're poor white people is slavery. So now, again, this book is not nearly as popular as this book, but between these two, you're starting to see that people are now making money writing texts about the wrongs of slavery and selling them. And so after Fillmore's, he succeeds to the presidency, but he is not going to be the nominee for the Whig Party. Again, the Whigs have discovered what's the only way to get elected. Run a general. So they run a general again, and this time they run Old Fuss and Feathers. But this time, a lot of Americans are starting to be alarmed because, well, honestly, this is not the election where too many people are alarmed. I don't know if still have this election. It's the next one. It's really good one. But in 1852, this basically comes down to one of these elections where you got to out-politic the other side. So you're going to hear simple slogans like, we polled them in 44 and we'll pierce them in 52, like silliness like that kind of stuff, right? So it's more about, this fellow from New Hampshire having, not really a bad record running against this guy who's, when people looked at Scott, they saw him as too imperious. You guys know that phrase? I mean, if you run as a general for president, not as, I mean, keep in mind, Washington was a general, but he didn't appear in like uniform. He just seemed too much like he wanted it. I guess is the best way to describe it. Like he was too much potentially a dictator. But even then, it really comes down to the fact that there was a third party. And so you're going to have a very, very close election in terms of the popular vote. See that? But overall, it is clear that the Democrats, the outcome of the Nashville Convention, remember the Nashville Convention? That put kind of a fear in the hearts of some Americans that if the Democrat's not elected, things might be bad for our country, right? Because they're the ones keeping the things going. But this is one of those elections where, by and large, it's more about slogans and campaigning than it is about, the success of the two candidates. Basically, the key is here, though, is that this is the last time the Whigs will run a candidate. Let that sink in. So the Whigs are going to be a brief major party in American history. And you're going to have the one major third party in American history become a primary party in history in the next election. So by the next election, the Republican Party is going to swallow the Whig Party. Okay, but it doesn't exist yet. So this is the last Whig candidacy for president. And what happens because of that is, as you can imagine, well, the Whigs were what kind of party? In terms of national votes, 1850, 1848, 1844. Well, they didn't tend to win, right? But where were they represented? Go way back here to 48. Where do you see Whig votes in 48? I'll get back there eventually. And I'm almost there. And there it is. Where do you see Whig votes?
South and
Where do you see Democrat votes?
west.
And right? So they're both national parties, right? Meaning they have supporters in the southern states and the northern states and the western states. Still do in 1852. All right, so if you go back to 1852, now it's not as big success, obviously, but nonetheless, I mean, here's the South, Tennessee, Kentucky, and New Hampshire and Massachusetts. So you have a variety there, but not much. So this is the last time the Whigs will run a candidate for president. It's something like that. The Republican Party will be in 1856. When? Know it's the Whigs and Democrats. Yeah, by the end of the Whigs, no less. Let me snag it for you. So when you're thinking about this election, this will be the last time. And when the Republicans run, where are they going to get votes only? Only in the North. Where are the Democrats going to get votes? So when you have a sectional party emerge.
So would you be upset if I wanted to spend $600?
Oh,
Okay. It's like it'll be not just me, but it's gonna cover a lot of things that we can share across the board. Okay. Some of
okay,
them-
so,
okay.
as long as you got what you want.
I mean, it does. I mean, I don't want to, take over people's
Well, just
money.
double check. That's not what me that you got to double check. Just make sure that that's not my money. That's my money.
Because it has to be spent by next.
That's right, right. So yeah, I'll try to send out an email.
Okay.
But I'm totally fine. Because it's
That's between 22 or 4. Okay.
yours. Thanks. All right, so Pierce. Let's talk about the Pierce presidency, because in many ways the Pierce presidency is really boring. But in some ways it's really interesting, because it's kind of like out of the blue, you have this single kind of issues that are going on, and it's expansion. So it's like expansion round 2. You remember I told you Polk in 44 and Pierce in 52? Well, it's kind of like the same attitude. It's still expansionist. Okay. The only problem is for Southerners, expansion is harder now. Why is it harder now? What do we run out of? Like places to expand, right? Based on what we think in our brains. But that's not what many Southerners are thinking. Keep in mind, Pierce is the first of what we're going to call dough-faced Democrats. So I do want you to write that down about Pierce. Buchanan will be one too. Dough-faced Democrats. So what does that mean? Dough-faced. You have dough for a face, you're malleable, you're soft. And these are 2 Northern Democrats. You're going to have Pierce from New Hampshire, and you're going to have Buchanan in 56 from Pennsylvania, who are both soft on slavery. Dough, get it? And much of their cabinet are going to be made up of Southerners who are strong on slavery, if you understand. So in order to keep the South happy, these dough-faced Democrats, Northern Democrats, will be supportive of whatever these Southern Democrats want, typically. So you start to see that the Democratic Party is shaping up to be a more just Southern party during this. Not completely yet, but the influence is there. So this is what starts to happen. If you go back, during Zachary Taylor's presidency, there had been an effort already to build a railroad through Panama. Why do we want to connect Panama across? That's right. We don't like going around the tip of South America, particularly as a result of the California gold rush. Keep in mind, 13,000 miles is a long ways, right? And so it is much easier just to go down to Panama, hop on a train. It takes about 7 weeks to do that, as opposed to, I don't know, 5-6 months. So the idea is that this would expedite speed transport over to California. But the problem is that, by the way, there is no Panama in 1849. Panama is part of the country of Colombia at that point in history. Panama is just like an extension of Colombia into the isthmus. All right? So we have begun building a railroad there, and we look like we would consider building a canal there. Keep in mind, this is the era of the canals, right? Erie Canal. The Suez Canal is being built in Egypt. You guys remember that one? But the British are also interested in building a canal in Nicaragua. Okay? Because it would benefit them commercially and for their needs. So what we agreed to do, believe this or not, is no one will build a canal as far as countries. This is called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. There will be no canal. Now, by the way, this again occurs under Zachary Taylor, not actually under Franklin Pierce. So it's in your book in this chapter because it's foreign affairs. But nonetheless, we will not fortify or build colonies in the region, and any private canal. By the way, a private company can build a canal, and they certainly will try. All right, Both powers will allow the other neutral bases to use it. So any canal zone in Latin America, Central America, will be neutral. Fair enough? So if you know your future history, you probably are aware that in the future, we build a Panama Canal under President Theodore Roosevelt. Well, to do that, we have to get rid of this thing. And he will. And that's a story of its own interest, okay? But for the next 50 years, no British or American country effort will be made to build a canal.
So does Roosevelt get rid of this tree or somebody before?
Roosevelt does himself, you know. Well, I mean, if you mean like, does he personally get it? No, he's going to send a Secretary of State, hey, he's going to get rid of it, which is Roosevelt Secretary of State, which was McKinley Secretary of State. He asked people to come. Now, that's not one where Roosevelt personally pushes it. But to build it, he'll start a civil war in Panama. That's pretty cool. All right. So nonetheless, foreign policy stuff. Now, I was talking to you about Pierce's administration, and this is where you first see the mention of filibusters. So the filibuster is come from a Spanish word for freebooter, which is basically like a land pirate. A land pirate. So what's a land pirate? A pirate on land. There's someone who builds a private army and invades a country. And that actually was happening. So you had Southerners who were actually making private armies and invading Southern countries, Southern Hemisphere countries, Latin American countries, with the intent of pulling a Texas. You understand what I mean by pulling a Texas? You invade the country, you take over the country, and then you ask to be annexed by America. And theoretically, the Pierce administration will be very fond of that, will be very pliable to that. So the idea is like you go start a civil war led by you, your country people. And so one of these attempts fails dramatically in Nicaragua. So you have this guy named William Walker, who was a merc by all accounts, a mercenary. And he is going to, with a private army, invade Nicaragua. Okay? And ask for Nicaragua to be annexed by the United States. Before that, the decision can be made on that, Honduras will build up a group of Central American soldiers and invade Nicaragua to kill William Walker. So he'll be shot before a firing squad. Okay? But he's a very fascinating guy because this is probably the most successful of the freebooters. He actually announces that he's the president of Nicaragua. So here you have American citizens invading Latin American countries, declaring themselves president of them, and then looking for annexation. Okay? Now, the bigger sort of plum that's out there is Cuba. Cuba is the more obvious location. It's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. It's a very rich colony in terms of sugar colony. The Spanish are weak. They've been utterly weakened by Napoleon. And so the U.S. does what the U.S. does. We should do what? We should buy it. You just buy it, right? And make an offer. Exactly. We're going to give them. That's right. We're going to get it, Christopher. We're going to give them the Godfather offer, right? We're going to make them an offer they can't refuse. The thing is that we do this in Belgium, in Oosten, Belgium. So American diplomats meet with Spanish diplomats and we really like to buy Cuba, but if not, we might just have to do something else. Keep in mind, it is Spain that lost Florida that way, right? But abolitionists get their hands on this meeting. They get the word out that this is happening. And they publish it in newspapers that America is potentially going to annex Cuba for what intent? For slavery. And as you can imagine, Pierce backs off. Once the public hears about this, he doesn't want to be involved in hijacking a country for the purpose of spreading slavery. But it does show you that this is how strongly slaveholders are very serious about the spread of slavery. They realize they're out of states in America, so we might as well add new states. And of course, if you're in Central America or Latin America, or the Caribbean, you're like, oh my gosh, they're coming for us, right? And that really was a fear about slavery spread. It also rose questions about something we haven't talked about in a while, and that's the Monroe Doctrine. Is it the right of America to invade other countries? That's one thing to say other countries can't invade Latin America, but it doesn't say we can, right? So, we're better. Well, later on, we are going to say that. That's funny you say that. Guess who's going to say it? Theodore Roosevelt. It's called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And he says, we'll invade those countries so y'all don't have to. All right. And so that's an interesting change, but we're not there yet. All right. So nonetheless, the Oster Manifesto failed. The manifesto is just like a statement of objective. William Walker fails. Several of these other freebooters or filibuster missions fail, but you can sense that this is like the Southern response to no more spread of slavery. So the slavery, and by the way, Abraham Lincoln writes about this. He writes a letter and talks about that if these guys succeed, that slavery, America's slave expansionists will have us all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. You understand where that is? Down to Chile. Sure, Jeff Davis. Yeah, a lot of Southern expansionists were comfortable with the idea of like the whole Western Hemisphere, not just keep spreading it, right? Like these pictures illustrate. So, the theory, and these are all attempted raids. You can see these various raids. There's Walker being the most famous. But, these are all, so you see, the writing was on the wall that Southerners were serious about creating new slave states, even if it meant invading other countries. So that's a big part of what becomes part of the dialogue in the Pierce era. All right, another thing that becomes famous in the Pierce era, which actually, again, your book takes us back pre this. So if you look back here, 1839 to 42 is during the presidency of Martin Van Buren, okay, and William Henry Harrison. So this is the Opium War. So up until Martin Van Buren's presidency, China had been closed for centuries. Maybe you learned in world history last year that the Qing dynasty or the Ming dynasties had been somewhat isolationist, right? Like not welcome to foreigners, as had Japan, right? Well, it's during this period that the Opium War occurs. And the Opium War opens China to the West. Now, of course, it starts off with Britain declaring war on China to force them to buy drugs, one of the most famous or infamous wars in history. It's not a war on drugs, but it's a war for drugs, right? So the Brits are making the Chinese buy their heroin, okay, buy their opium. And we're like, hey, we want in on the game. Not so much the heroin part, but, we want to trade with China too. And so you have our first treaty with China signed right before James K. Polk takes office. Okay, so this is actually done under John Tyler. All right. So Tyler negotiates with Cushing what we call MFN status, which means we can trade with China. They'll accept Christian missionaries here. So for the first time, American Christians will go to China to be missionaries. So if you've heard of like the Lottie Moon Christmas offering or the Annie Armstrong Easter offering, these were Christian missionary women who went to China. Okay, and then we are going to pull off a sort of opium war of our own, and that is Matthew Perry is going to sail into. Now he's sent actually under Millard Fillmore. He's the president who orders him, but under President Pierce, he secures the Treaty of Kanagawa. So this is the first country to open trade with Japan. Now, how we get the Treaty of Kanagawa is these steamships with cannons roll into what was then called Edo, now Tokyo Bay. The Tokugawa shoguns and the emperor see this. They meet with Matthew Perry. Perry basically either open trade and let our sailors come back and forth from your because by the way, if you shipwrecked in Japan, they wouldn't let you go, or they'd kill you, So there was it was so cut off. And Japan is, if you know anything about Asian geography, Japan is in the way on the way to Korea and China. And so they want fueling stations in Japan. They want to trade with Japan. And the shogun considers killing Matthew Perry and the men with samurai swords, but then they realize the ships can blow up the palace and kill the emperor. In other words, this is modern industry staring at 16th century feudalism. Okay? And so this is the moment when Japan is you know what? We might all modernize. All right. And within 60 years, they're going to go from being a medieval country to a country that's beaten Russia in warfare. You understand? So Japan, this is that moment, and it occurs during President Pierce. So I know none of this sounds like slavery or sectionalism. It's not. It's in the midst of this chapter, I mean, not none of it, but some of this is just foreign policy. It's like a foreign policy catch-up. All right. And so the treaty does occur during President Pierce, as does the Oster Manifesto. Those are the two big ones under him. Be familiar with both of them. And then, go ahead.
Sorry. Can you guys know this? What is the most favored nations?
right, so if you have most favored nation status, that means you get to trade without like barriers with another country, like without tariffs. So you see where it says the right of extraterritoriality? That means you get to set, later these are going to be done in history as spheres of influence. Today, there's a term for them in China. They're industrial, they're like industrial parks, but basically American businesses operating in China are exempt from Chinese laws while there, as far as like tax laws and stuff like that. So most favored nation status means you're a trade partner with the country. In other words, you're like on good relations. And so like today, Britain would be this certainly, but China is this now. President Clinton resumed most favored nation status with China in the 90s, you know, which I was never a big fan of then or now, but you know, it sure means we have cheap stuff, right? that's awesome. But anyway, it does mean that you don't have to compete with, and again, I would remind you that like Polk particularly is a big fan of free trade. You know, so that's going to be a common theme for the Democrats more and more. It's like trade with everybody sure is better than shooting everybody, unless it's America shooting each other. Sadly. All right, now the other thing under Pierce, which is also foreign related, sort of, but also Southern related, is this event that occurs in 1853 called the Gadsden Purchase. I was hinting at it yesterday. So when we got the Mexican cession from the Mexican War, this southern portion of Arizona, and I don't know the mountain range that's right here. It's one of those Pacific coast ranges that come all the way down. But down in New Mexico and Arizona is, well, actually Arizona, not New Mexico so much, but is a mountain range that comes basically to where the southern, like where Baja almost starts. But below that, it's much flatter. And so Jefferson Davis, future president of the Confederacy, is a senator from Mississippi, okay, who has now become the Secretary of War, which is one of the three most important cabinet members. But he has that very important position. And he very much wants a southern transcontinental railroad. Everybody hear that? So everybody wants to get to California. And if the terminus is in Jackson, Mississippi, or Biloxi, will that help Mississippi? Or if it's in New Orleans, will it help the South? Yep. So he wants to build a transcontinental railroad that'll run through the South up to California, right? But to do that, he actually needs where the land is flatter. So they send a negotiator down, obviously the fellow's name is Gadsden, down to Mexico, and what does he do?
Offer $10 million for that piece of land.
He gets basically the entire price of the Mexican cession, initial price, for that little strip of land. So Mexico is going to get $10 million for this, but is Davis going to be able to make it run this transcontinental railroad here? Yeah, okay, and that's why this guy steps in. So guys, when we talk about epochal or like shifting events, these train discussions are going to change the whole dynamic of what leads to the Civil War. So Jeff Davis, see now the race is where will there be a railroad to California? And Jeff Davis wants it, the first one to be here. Whoever's first is going to make the most money probably, right? Well, Stephen Douglas wants to be president. This is Stephen Douglas who helped get the Compromise of 1850 through the Congress. Senator Douglas would love to be president. The problem is, for him, he's a Northern Democrat, right? And so he needs to get Southern Democrats to trust him to make him their candidate. Okay? Pull off what Pierce has pulled off. So he starts thinking, how can I help my state, he's from Illinois, and the South? That's to consider. But he's a smart politician, so it doesn't take him too long. He says, I know what I want. I want the train, the Transcontinental Railroad, to run to Chicago. Right? Chicago, right there. Maybe even down through Missouri. Problem is, who doesn't want that? Jeff Davis, right? Among others. Jefferson Davis, important dude, right? So Douglas comes up with this genius move. Why don't we allow the people of Kansas and Nebraska to vote on slavery or not? Let that sink in. First of all, why is that a problem?
It would violate the Missouri Compromise.
Absolutely. The Missouri Compromise has been on the books since 1820, right? And it said no slavery above that dark black line right there. Kansas and Nebraska are clearly above that black line right there. So who was kind of accepted they're not going to be able to have slaves in here? Not only the, first of all, there's nobody there except for Native Americans. Just practically no one settled here. But who else has resigned themselves to think that won't be any slavery? Southerners. And then out of the clear blue sky, a northerner says, we'll allow the possibility of slavery in Kansas or Nebraska. And not just any northerner, but one of the most shrewd senators in the U.S. Senate, right? And so Southerners are all of a sudden celebrating. They're like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. We might theoretically have slavery spread in the continental United States, right? Something we thought was off the table. So what's Douglas's motive? Why is he doing this? All right, a couple of reasons. He wants a railroad to go to Illinois, right? Don't forget that part. But he also wants to secure whose support? Southerners to run for president. And will Southerners support this? Yeah. You better believe it. Like, this is a big deal to have more American slave states, right? So this is a double whammy. Now, what does he use as the legitimacy to let them do this? He's going to use what term? What term that's very famous now? We were just talking about at the beginning of class. How will he let the good people of Kansas and Nebraska determine if they have slavery or not? Popular sovereignty. Ah, it's very democratic sounding. So that's not bad, right? So if you're Stephen Douglas, who had heard Lewis Cass's idea, right? Who saw that it had an appeal and was democratic. But what's the obvious problem? Well, keep in mind, any law that's passed can be undone by any future law. Right. So it's not just that it violates the Compromise of 1820. It allows for the potential what? Spread of slavery. So if you're an abolitionist or a free soiler, particularly the free soilers, were you sitting around worrying about slavery in Kansas in 1853? No, you were worried about slavery in Cuba, right? You were worried about slavery in Nicaragua being spread. But now you have a guy you thought was reasonable saying, well, let's just potentially let slavery go where? In Nebraska or Kansas. Now, pretty clear that Douglas expected which territory would vote for slavery? Kansas, and then the other one wouldn't. So he kind of expected, see how Missouri looks like it would just spread westward? Yeah. But he grotesquely, I mean, for such a smart politician, he really, really misses it. He terribly underestimates how strong opposition to this will be. You understand? Like, this is a terrible blunder. Now, I think it's because he got selfish in the way of wanting to be president. Like, he missed the big picture, unfortunately. How is he now going to be sort of received in the North? By many, many people. Yes, that's right, like a traitor. What's Pierce going to do, though? He's going to support it. Go for it. Thumbs up. So this is going to create a civil war before the Civil War. Yep. Okay? So Douglas makes a terrible misjudgment, and the results of this are crucial. So I would be sure to be familiar with this. This is going to strengthen the division between the abolitionists and the fire eaters. They're going to get even more heated now. So this is the post-compromise era. People are going to actively oppose the fugitive slave law to even greater numbers. So any of the spirit of the Compromise of 1850 just gets wrecked. So, the book I think mentions it wrecks two compromises. Yep. Because the law passes. That's how influential Douglas is. You understand? Plus, Southern senators and Southern congressmen support it. So it destroys both compromises, 1820 and 1850. Now you have hostile opposition to fugitive slave catching. The Democrats will now shrink from being a Northern party at all to almost a purely Southern party. You understand? They're going to lose their national appeal. And as a result, this party is born. So if you're ever asked what creates the Republican Party, the Republican Party is born as a protest to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Like, that's literally why they organize, why they get together in Wisconsin to say, all right, it's time to create a new party that's firmly opposed to the spread of slavery, not somewhat opposed to it in some parts of the country. So you have a variety of people made up in this party. You have what were once called conscience Whigs. This would be Abraham Lincoln. Conscience Whigs were free soilers before they were conscience Whigs. They're people who are opposed to the spread of slavery. Northern Democrats who are not comfortable with how firmly the Southern Democrats are seeking to spread slavery. And they really don't like the rhetoric of who. If you went to a Democratic convention, the Southerners were saying we ought to do what every time you went? Secede. So if you're a Northern Democrat, you really want to be the party of the secessionists? So that means you're in trouble. Now, Douglas will remain a Democrat. And he's going to run for president as a Democrat. And he's going to lose. All right? But, the Northern Democrats are going to become a shrinking group. Free soilers, I mentioned them. But interestingly enough, the know-nothings land in the Republican Party. When you think about the modern Republican Party, there's always been a strain of nativism in the Republican Party since the beginning. Abraham Lincoln will overtly reject this. He is not a nativist, but he is a Republican. Understand? But nonetheless, there will be know-nothings like it's kind of one of those things where our party's not going to win. We might as well join the party that's not open to immigrants as much. Keep in mind, the party of immigrants were the Democrats. Still are, historically. Okay? And then you had anybody else who thought the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a really bad idea. So Douglas here, short-term selfish interests obliterate his long-term interests, I think. He really screws this up here. Now, your book's going to tell you about, and you'll read about the next chapter. At the last minute, Douglas is going to sort of save his reputation. When we learn about a place called Bleeding, Kansas. Well, I'll tell you about Bleeding, Kansas. So what begins to happen in Kansas, here's Kansas. So Kansas was always intended to be a place where people would vote on whether or not they had slavery, under popular sovereignty, if that's what's going to happen. But immediately, what it created were pro and anti-slavery people moved there. So in other words, it became a battleground. Rather than bring slaves there and just be farmers, or not bring slaves there and be farmers, you had people migrate there with the intent of voting pro or anti-slavery. You understand? That's literally why they moved there. And the anti-slavery forces were led by a company called the New England, E with an E right here, Immigrant Aid Company. And they came armed with what were named after Lyman Beecher, Beecher's Bibles. A Beecher's Bible is that. It's a rifle, okay? So many of these were people who moved from Massachusetts and from New Hampshire, Connecticut, New York, who wanted to prevent slavery from coming to Kansas. Keep in mind, nobody brought their slaves to Kansas. Why? Why wouldn't people bring a slave to Kansas? You really want to bring a slave where that's going on? Where they're shooting people? Right? So there'll be virtually no slaves at all in Kansas when they go to vote on whether or not there should be slavery in Kansas. So that's in the next chapter, I do believe. But be aware that this is going to create an internal civil war in America 4 years prior to the Civil War in America. It is a civil war in Kansas called what? Bleeding, Kansas. Okay? So that should conclude chapter, what is this, 18? See, you go through these long chapters, it takes a while, and then we get these shorter chapters that come real fast. I've always thought 17 and 18 could be one chapter, but nonetheless, we'll stop it with that for today. Looking